Welcome back, everyone. Now that we have wrapped up our study on the Transfiguration, we are ready to dive into the next presentation in our series on the divinity of Jesus Christ. Today, we are looking at an incredibly powerful, iconic story, Jesus walking on the water. For this study, I want to focus specifically on St. Matthew's version of this miracle. Out of all of the Gospels, Matthew gives us one of the longest and most detailed accounts of this event because he includes a famous moment the others leave out. I don't know if you noticed that. The story of Peter stepping out of the boat and walking on the water himself, at least for a little while, because his faith wavers, as you may have noticed, and he starts to drown. So let us look at this whole text together, okay? So we are diving into the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 through 33, those who are following in the Bible. As we always do, we will start with the Gospel narrative itself, and then we will head back into the Old Testament to uncover the deep structural connections hidden beneath the surface. So let's get to the text. Matthew writes, "Then he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray." Notice that Jesus always prays. How many times in the gospel we keep hearing this, right? He went to pray. He went to pray, went up on the mountain to pray himself. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was many furlongs distant from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. So, doing the math, where was the boat? It says many furlongs. Now, I want to pause right here for a moment and talk about the geography of this miracle. Where exactly was this boat when the storm hit? Matthew tells us they were many furlongs distant from the land. But if we jump over to a parallel account in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 6, verse 19, John gives us a highly specific eyewitness detail. He writes, St. John, that the disciples had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs. For most of us reading this today, furlongs doesn't mean much. So let's do a little quick biblical math to visualize this. In the ancient system, exactly 8 furlongs equals 1 mile. I'll say this again, okay? 8 furlongs in the ancient time equals in today's 1 mile. So if you divide 25 furlongs by 8, you get just over 3 miles. So if you divide 30 furlongs by 8, you get about 3.75 miles. This means that when the storm rolled in, the disciples were not just hovering safely near the shoreline. It's very important. I'll tell you why it's very important later on. They were right out in the dead center of the Sea of Galilee. Think about that. Over 3.5 miles away from safety. They were stuck in a vulnerable wooden fishing boat, completely surrounded by deep, raging waters, fighting a brutal headwind in the dark of night, if you think about it. When you understand the sheer distance, it set the stage for just how terrifying the situation was and how shocking it would be when a figure came walking across those 3 miles of open ocean. Okay, so let's continue the story here. I'm just trying to move my PowerPoint. It's just a little bit slow. All right. So to put this further into perspective, the Sea of Galilee is only about 8 miles wide in its absolute widest point. Being roughly 3.5 miles out means they were effectively stranded right in the dead center of the sea, essentially far away from safety of either shore during a violent and dangerous storm. From a theological standpoint, understanding this distance completely changes how we view the miracle. Jesus didn't just step off the beach and walk a few feet on some shallow water near the coast. Some skeptics could say this. He walked miles over a churning, roaring great sea. As the Gospel of St. John, chapter 6, verse 18 describes it, just to reach them. So this is where our presentation's focus on his divinity really shines. If you go back to the Old Testament, which we'll be doing on a regular basis in our presentations, okay? Because remember, I think it was Saint Augustine who said this, the old is revealed in the new, and the new is hidden in the old. Without the Old Testament, you will not see the context of Jesus Christ. You have to be familiar with the Old Testament accounts. So if you go back to the Old Testament, who is the only one with the power to master the ocean? Let's look for a reference. In the book of Job, chapter 9, verse 8, it explicitly says of the Almighty that he alone stretched out to the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. By walking miles out onto the open ocean, Jesus is physically doing what the Hebrew scriptures say only the Creator God can do. So, what is the timing of this miracle? It's very important. It says the fourth watch. What does it mean? The fourth watch. So, let us continue with Matthew's account. And in the fourth watch of the night, okay, let's pause right there and explain this. Okay, what is the fourth watch of the night? So, if you go back to the first century, the Roman military system of dividing the night into four equal blocks had replaced the older traditional Jewish system of three watches. So the Romans designed these watches so constantly rotate their sentries. So why did they design this? Every watch they will rotate their sentries so that the guard stayed alert. So each watch lasted approximately 3 hours. It's like watching in the night, watching for somebody, watching for bad people and things. That's why it's called watch. So keep awake, watching. So the exact timing could shift slightly depending on the season and the hours of darkness. But then the Roman designed three watches. Okay, so here is how the night was broken down. So the first watch, let's call it evening, 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Second watch, let's say midnight, 9 p.m. to 12 midnight or 12 a.m. The third watch, cock crow, right? It's early in the morning. So 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. And the fourth and the final watch will be the morning, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Okay, with that in context, think about what this timing means for our story. The disciples had been rowing since the evening. They had been out on the water, fighting for their lives against a brutal storm for hours upon hours. By the time the fourth watch arrives, now that you know what a fourth watch is, between 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., It is somewhere between 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. It is the darkest, coldest, and most exhausting part of the night. It's just right before the dawn. They are physically spent, emotionally drained, and that is precisely the moment Jesus chooses to step onto the waves. How awesome is that? So let us keep reading. As noted in the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 14, verse 25, the text tells us, and in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. Wow. Awesome. Awesome. It must have been such an awesome scene for the disciples. When you really stop to consider this specific timing, it adds several layers of dramatic and theological depth through the story. So let's break it down. First, the human exhaustion. We kind of alluded to a minute ago. The disciples hadn't just been rowing for an hour or two, they had been straining against a violent, contrary wind since the previous evening. Almost since the previous evening, actually, they set off sail. By the time the fourth watch rolls around, somewhere between 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., they were at the absolute peak of physical and mental exhaustion, wouldn't you say? Second, the darkest hour. This watch represents the period of deepest pitch black darkness right before the sun breaks over the horizon. It beautifully highlights how Jesus tends to appear in our lives precisely when human hopes seem most distant. Third, the absolute distance. As we calculated just a moment ago, they were miles out into the open sea. For Jesus to track them down and reach them across miles of moving water by the fourth watch, which is pitch dark, demonstrates his total, absolute mastery over the elements during the most difficult part of the night. So, what is the Exodus connection here? The morning watch. Now, I want to take a quick aside here because there is an incredible Old Testament link hidden in the timing of this watch. Under the older Jewish system, the final block of the night was called the morning watch. If you quickly go back to the book of Exodus, chapter 14, verse 24, do you know when God chose to intervene, part the Red Sea, and throw the chasing Egyptian army into the complete panic? The Bible explicitly says it happened during the morning watch. You can go back and check it out. I absolutely love linking these two accounts for an audience because it is an incredibly powerful way to show Jesus exercising the exact same divine authority as Yahweh in the Exodus account. So the same God who delivered Israel by conquering the waters in the morning watch is now walking on top of the water in the fourth watch to deliver his new covenant disciples. And what is this all about? It's a ghost. Okay, so let's pick the narrative back up in Matthew's account. So the story continues. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately he spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Have no fear." Let me repeat that, okay? Take heart, it is I. Have no fear. And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, bid me," Peter Again, there's a Peter, the always he's jumping in the first, okay, before anyone else. So he said, Lord, if it's you, bid me come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink. Then he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "O man of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him. And in Greek it's proskuneho. We'll explain that later. They worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God. Truly, you are the Son of God." That's what the disciples said, and they worshipped him. Talk about a roller coaster of emotions. They go from absolute terror, thinking they are seeing some kind of a phantom or sea demon, to hearing the reassuring voice of Christ. And then we see Peter acting as the bold spokesperson for the group once again, stepping out of the safety of the boat to test the waters. Okay, so let's pause right here. There is an incredible amount of theology packed into this vital passage. Okay, so this is why I wanted to do this Gospel of Matthew. It's the longest and most rich. So we're going to walk through it step by step and look at several key points. The first thing we absolutely have to highlight is the setting of this miracle. So this event takes place immediately after the famous feeding of the 5,000 in the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. So this is, you can call it the inseparable twin miracles. One of the reasons this structural order is so important for us to notice is that this exact same sequence occurs in three of the four Gospels: St. Matthew, St. Mark, and St. John. All contain distinct accounts of Jesus walking on the water. And in all three, the miracles on the sea immediately follow the feeding of the 5,000. They are treated almost like a pair of inseparable twin miracles. First, Jesus feeds the 5,000, then he walks on the water. Just right in the immediate wake of multiplying those 5 loaves and 2 fish for a massive crowd that Jesus withdraws from everyone. As we read before, he climbs up the mountain by himself to pray. Night falls, and while he's up there communing with the Father, the disciples set off across the Sea of Galilee in their boat. That's what happened. So, what is the deeper meaning? Is there a deeper meaning? Think about the progression here, like a trajectory. Jesus had just demonstrated absolute mastery over the earthly creation by doing what? Multiplying bread and fish in the wilderness. But almost immediately, he turns around and demonstrates absolute mastery over the cosmic forces of the nature by stepping out onto the raging sea. By placing these two massive signs back to back, the Gospels are showing us that whether it's the land or the sea, the wilderness or the storm, everything in creation answers to the voice of Jesus Christ. I would say the voice and also the feet of Jesus Christ. So let's consider the timing once again. The fourth watch of the night, we are talking about the deep middle of the night, sometime between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Now, for most of us, being out on a boat in the pitch dark at 4 a.m. in the morning sounds crazy, right? But for the apostles, navigating the waters at this hour was actually second nature. They were all fishermen. As seasoned fishermen, it was completely customary for them to fish at night. We see this vividly in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 21, verse 3, where they spend the entire night out on the water, casting their nets. So traveling in the dark wasn't a problem. They were totally used to that. What they were absolutely not used to, however, was being stuck in the dead center of the massive lake in the middle of a pitch black storm and seeing a human figure casually strolling toward them on top of the crashing waves. They were not prepared for this, but that's exactly what Jesus does here. He comes to them walking on the sea. So when the disciples look out into the storm and see this figure, their immediate gut reaction is sheer terror. They scream out because they assume he's a ghost. Now, this is a fascinating detail because it gives us a little window into the first century world. Actually, it used to be the world view of the first century. So it shows us that at least some of the disciples believed in ghosts or spirits, as you can call them. So they know the laws of physics. They know a normal flesh and blood human being cannot stand on water. They knew this. Therefore, in their panic, they assume they're looking at a supernatural spirit or a sea phantom. So, is there a clue of a theophany? But notice how Jesus immediately responds to their screams. He speaks right through the wind and says, "Take heart, have no fear." So, this response is our major clue that we should characterize this entire event not just as a neat magic trick, but as a genuine theophany. What's a theophany? It's a visible manifestation of the Almighty God. If you track theophanies all throughout the Old Testament, a distinct repetitive pattern emerges. So, first, the human reaction. Whenever God reveals his raw power, glory, and presence to human beings on earth, the immediate human response is always overwhelming fear and awe. And what the divine response? Because human nature handles the divine presence with trembling, God's very first move is almost always to quell that terror. He steps in and he says, "Be calm, do not be afraid." And only then does he deliver his message. So, by walking on the water and immediately commanding their fear to cease, Jesus is acting exactly like Yahweh, appearing to the patriarchs and prophets of old. He is stepping into the storm not just as their teacher, but as the Lord of hosts. Now, let's look at the absolute peak of this miracle. The specific word Jesus uses to reveal his identity. After he tells them to take heart and have no fear, he says, "It is I." So this is so packed. It is I. If you look at the literal Greek text, behind that expression, it is I. The phrase is ego eimi, ego eimi in Greek. That means it is I. Well, most English Bibles render this as it is I or it is me. It is literally translates to something else. It translates to take heart, I am, ego eimi. Okay, if you see the NIV and the different versions of the Bible that we have today, they all have something different. It is I, it is me, and whatever. But then it actually means in the Greek text, take heart, I am. So why that is important? On a purely human level, ego eimi can certainly be used as a simple way to identify yourself. Yes, you can say it is I. If someone calls out in the dark, is that you? You could respond with ego eimi to mean, yes, it's me. But in this specific context, you see, the context is extremely important. In what context all this happening? The meaning runs infinitely deeper. Jesus is not just identifying himself to his frightened friends. He is taking the sacred divine name of God from the Old Testament and claiming it as his own. So it is the so-called the name above all names. By using the phrase I am, ego eimi, Jesus is deliberately alluding to the most famous theophany in the entire Bible, which is the appearance of God to Moses at the burning bush in the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 13 through 15. In that monumental encounter, God calls Moses to go to the Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt and bring them a message of deliverance. Now, Moses looks at God and asked a very practical question. If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And how did the Lord respond? He says to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. I am, all caps, always, has sent me to you. That's what he tells Moses to do. So he says, I am is my name forever. And thus, I am to be remembered throughout all generations. So the title I am is the supreme revelation of God's eternal, self-existent nature. It is the divine name. So in fact, it's the triple proof of divinity. When you take a step back and look at the scene on the Sea of Galilee, a powerful theological mosaic comes together. To truly prove his divinity to the disciples, Jesus brings three undeniable elements together at the exact same time. Number one, the action. He is walking on top of a raging sea, a power that the book of Job, chapter 9, verse 8 says belongs to God alone. Number two is the language. He commands them, have no fear, which is the standard authoritative language God uses during an Old Testament theophany to calm human terror. The third one is the name, which is just we discussed that. He speaks the words ego eimi, boldly declaring I am, right into the teeth of the storm. When you couple these three things together, the conclusion is inescapable. Jesus is not just a holy man or a gifted prophet. You can do a neat trick. He's revealing his full divinity. He's showing his disciple that the very same God who spoke from the burning bush and parted the Red Sea is now standing on the waves right in front of them. This brings us to a critical apologetic point. Skeptics often claim that the deity of Christ is an invention of the later Gospels of John. They will point to John's highly explicit statements like, I and the Father are one, in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 10, verse 30. Or another verse, before Abraham was, I am. Again, in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 58. They argue that the synoptic Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, present a merely human Jesus. On the contrary, this perspective completely overlooked the profound theophanies woven directly into the synoptic narratives. One of the most striking examples of this is Jesus walking on the water. So let's just understand the context of ego eimi. When Jesus approaches the terrified disciples in that boat, he does not merely say, hey guys, it's just me. In the original Greek of the Gospel of St. Matthew, we are looking at chapter 14, verse 27. Jesus says, take heart, ego eimi, I am, do not be afraid. Well, this functions on a surface level as a simple identification to the disciples who thought they saw a ghost. The structural context elevates it to a supreme divine revelation. By using the phrase ego eimi, Jesus is deliberately echoing the language of the burning bush from the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verse 14, where God revealed his sacred name to Moses. God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Another aspect of this is the divine power over the deep. What makes this moment irrefutable is that Jesus' claim to be the I am is immediately validated by his physical setting. In the Hebrew scriptures, the ability to walk upon, crush, or subdue the chaotic sea is a power reserved strictly and exclusively for the Creator God. By walking on top of those crashing waves, Jesus is physically acting out the very descriptions of Yahweh, which is found throughout the Old Testament. I know we said this before. The book of Job, chapter 9, verse 8, describes God who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. Also in Psalm 77, verse 19, it says, your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. Again in Psalm 107, verse 29, praise to the God because he made the storm be still and the waves of the sea were hushed. So what is the unmistakable conclusion? When you present this to your audience, you can wrap up this, powerful. If you're going to do this you should do this to an audience. You can wrap this up with a powerful section within an explanation like this. So my friend, Jesus isn't just performing a magic trick. Okay. So he missed the boat. He's intentionally revealing his cosmic identity through a flawless combination of divine speech and divine action. He uses the unique name of God, which simultaneously exercising the exclusive authority of God. So this is why the skeptic's argument falls apart. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus doesn't always need to state that exact phrase, I am God. Okay, just like in the modern English terms, because his actions commanding the raw elements of creation and invoking the sacred name speak with unmistakable clarity that he is the absolute Lord of the storm, God come in the flesh. So this brings us to a beautiful realization about their confession. So I may have skipped one of the slides. So just give me 1 second. My slides are moving a little bit faster. Oh, there it is. So while the I am statement and the physical act of walking on the water reveal Jesus' identity, the reaction of the disciples in the boat confirmed that they understood exactly what was happening. Because look at their response. Their response serves as the ultimate climax of this entire episode. So, in the strict, unyielding monotheism of the Jewish tradition, worship referred to in the Greek. So, I know I mentioned this before. There's a word in the Greek called proskeneho. Okay, proskeneho. It was reserved strictly and exclusively for the Creator God, like worshiping God. To offer this kind of worship to a mere man, a great prophet, or even a heavenly angel was considered the highest form of blasphemy in the Jewish tradition. You only worship God, the Almighty. And yet, look at the dramatic conclusion of the miracle in the Matthew's account, in St. Matthew's account. And it says, and those in the boat worshipped him, proskoneho, saying, truly you are the Son of God. You can go and check this. It's the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 14, verse 33. So the disciples don't just say, wow, thanks for saving us. They actually fall to their knees. Their physical posture and their verbal confession both prove that the revelation hit the mark. They recognize that the man standing in the boat with them was the very Lord of the universe. So by accepting this worship, Jesus explicitly confirms his divinity. If he was merely a human teacher, a holy rabbi, just a highly gifted miracle worker, Jewish law and piety would have obligated him to stop them immediately. He sees this standard human and angelic boundary. We see this all the time, enforced all through the rest of the New Testament. So the apostles, okay, in the book of Acts, chapter 14, verses 14 and 15, when the crowds in Lystra try to offer sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas, the apostles tear the clothes in horror and scream, men, why are you doing this? We are all men of like nature with you. And also in the book of Revelation, chapter 22, verse 8 and 9, when St. John falls down to worship the glorious angel, who showed him the heavenly visions, the angel instantly rebukes him. And the angel tells St. John, you must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you. Worship God. But notice that Jesus does not deflect. He doesn't tear his garments, and he doesn't tell them to stand up. Instead, Jesus quietly and powerfully receives their worship as his rightful due. Okay, so I want to thank you for your patience. So let's bring it all together. So, my friends, this is the ultimate mic drop moment for the divinity of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels. The disciples started the night terrified of a ghost, but they ended the night worshiping the living God. By accepting that worship right there on the stormy sea, Jesus validates their confession that he is the Son of God. He doesn't correct them because their theology was perfect. He truly is the Son of God come in the flesh. Thank you, everyone, and I will see you in my next presentation. God bless.